you confirm to me, please, your team number for government?
51.
51. Opposition?
60.
60, thank you. So you don't need any translation, that's okay. For decorum, just to remind you to respect colleague at all times, you stand up when we call you, etc., you wear a hat. Then for the time, she will show you how she will present you the time during the presentation.
So when you have, like, when it's been 1 minute that you have been talking, you have 4 minutes left.
For the first speech of 5 minutes, for instance.
Then 3 minutes left, then 2 minutes left, 1 minute left, and finally 30 seconds. And when you use the 5 minutes, I will make this sign, which means that you have 15 seconds extra. And when I'm here, you don't have any more time.
And then the last 10 seconds also.
Before the 15 seconds, yeah.
C'est bon?
I think only 5.
Non, c'est, mettons, 4 minutes 50.
Ah oui, c'est ça, puis le 10 secondes, puis après c'est l'extra, quasiment.
Ok.
Parfait.
Puis en dessous, dans les 30 secondes, il faut taper pour le protected time. They have protected time. You have 35 seconds are protected, so no question can be asked before the first 30 seconds and the last 30 seconds. You will see the sign for the last 30 seconds, but for the first, we will not to tell you that you're allowed to ask questions. Do you have any questions right now? Okay. All right, so if you don't have any questions, I will call Prime Minister for her or his speech, her speech of 5 minutes, for which first and last 30 seconds are protected from any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, in our current climate, Canadian media content is very lacking, and we would like to create an opportunity for Canadian producers to have more content readily available to Canadians. And with that said, the motion we are bringing forward today is, be it resolved that the Government of Canada compels internet service providers to pay an additional tax to finance the Canadian Media Fund. Now, the first thing I would like to do is be very clear on what the terms of the motion is, and that is we are compelling internet providers and not mandating them. This is an entirely optional tax that internet providers can pay into, and they do not have to, nor are they required to. What we're going to do for you, Mr. Speaker, is we will be presenting to you 4 arguments, 2 social, 1 economic, and another member of government will be presenting our 4th argument. So the first argument we're going to be looking at is the economic argument. So as already mentioned, we are compelling and not mandating, and in turn what this is going to do is we are increasing the taxes to increase the Canadian content. So if Canadian internet service providers in turn put money into the fund, they will receive more Canadian content, and this in turn creates more content for everybody. So we want to see that there's more available content, and as well this is also going to be an all-Canadian production. So this is content produced by Canadians for Canadians. There is not going to be any externals coming in to make this production. It's only going to be Canadians. And what this does is, by having this money come in, is in turn it's going to be money in, money out. So we can create more content and we can further increase any additional revenues that can come from this by having this additional Canadian content, as well as having this more media available. Mr. Speaker, what we see right now is this lacking of media platforms and platforms for voices to be heard. And with this, in turn, we will be having this tax to further allow for this to happen. Which brings me to the second argument, which is a social argument, Mr. Speaker. And this is a social argument in terms of what benefits this provides for the internet service providers, for the companies. This creates that media content. It also allows for them to display our Canadian pride, Mr. Speaker. We are very proud to be Canadian here, and we are very proud to show who we are and change the dialogue from what it is right now. There's a lot of misconceptions on who we are as Canadians and what we do as Canadians, and having these media platforms available and broadening that, having the providers being able to provide this content, is an improvement, and it'll help better for everyone to better understand who we are, what we represent, and who are Canadians and what we do. As well as it provides that global exposure, because Mr. Speaker, while this is Canadian content and this is Canadian media providers, these media platforms are going to be available internationally. This is going to be something that's available for everybody. So Mr. Speaker, we see that this actually allows for that greater exposure, and it allows for in an international stage for the views to be changed. It allows for people to see who we are, what we do, and it is a benefit to the companies to contribute. Because if they contribute, we can see that their content will be better displayed and it'll be better aired, and we'll see that it's more available. And this brings me to the third argument, which is what is the benefit for Canadian citizens? We have the internet service providers paying in, but then what do Canadians get out of this? Mr. Speaker, as we've already said, it helps to create and change that image. People can see what's on the internet, and it's so easy to go on your phone or your computer and look up social media websites or look up Canadian content and see what's out there. But when you think of certain things, you look it up on the internet or you try to get information on it, you see that it's very limited, and you see that Canadians don't actually get the results that they're looking for. And we need to change this. By having these internet providers creating this content, by having this tax in place, it allows for the people to receive this additional content. It allows for them to change the dialogue and receive this better and probably more available options of content. And we need to recognize, Mr. Speaker, that this is going to be very beneficial for Canadian citizens. And we need to show that it's not only American content that's out there, and it's not just this sort of one-sided conversation that we're having. We want to make sure that the content is available. So, Mr. Speaker, by having this tax in place, we are increasing the amount of content available. We are providing Canadian content with that platform to really voice what they want and allowing them to have this much bigger platform than what we currently have. And we see that this is very important, Mr. Speaker. We need to recognize that our platform is very small right now, and we want to make it as big as we can. We want to be able for everyone internationally to see what our platform is. So what are we really looking at, Mr. Speaker? We're looking at how for the internet companies, that by creating this content, we are really reinforcing that Canadian pride. We're showing that we are proud to be who we are and what we have to offer, and that we aren't just under the stigma of what people think we currently are. And finally, Mr. Speaker, what we see is for the people, for Canadians, that this is going to benefit them long term, and we're going to see that this is going to change the dialogue. And it's for these reasons that we are proud to propose.
Thank you. And I'll call the Chief of Opposition for his first speech of 5 minutes, for which the first and last 30 seconds are protected.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, honorable judges, members of the government. Today we are here to discuss the motion that this government would like to compel ISPs to pay an additional tax to finance the Canadian Media Fund. Today I'll begin by discussing the three arguments brought forward by side opposition. I will begin then to discuss one point, the economic burden on the consumer. And finally I will conclude by refuting side government's arguments. To begin, it's inevitable that once you compel a corporation to pay an extra tax, that tax will be passed off onto the consumer. The burden that is brought with this added tax will not be paid for by the corporation. There are two inevitable possibilities in this scenario. The first being an increase in prices for the consumers. If this is the case, consumers are already paying a lot of money, sometimes close to $75 a month, for their internet services. The areas that will be impacted the most are areas like rural areas that already have received their services to a delayed extent to that of, for example, urban areas. And now they'll be paying even more for their services. They're the ones who need the internet access the most to be able to have a broader reach, a broader scope of information, and they will be the ones suffering. And if instead they choose not to pass on the hike in prices, what will happen is an inevitable decrease in the quality of the services. Economically, there has to be some sort of compromise. Either the price increases or their costs decrease. So how will their costs decrease? Well, the first one is going to be manpower. The easiest way to reduce costs nowadays is with technology and reducing manpower. And let's not forget that these Canadian internet service providers have stakeholders that are employees, that are their employees' families, and these are the people that will be suffering when their jobs are lost to compensate for this tax. There's also a danger that comes with this sort of tax. the danger that these ISPs will now be a little biased towards this Canadian content. While we understand the government's argument that Canadian content is important, what's even more important is unbiased information towards the Canadian citizen to make sure that they're informed and they have all the information needed readily available to them from an unbiased source. Moving on to refutation. Side opposition is a little confused as to why this would be a non-obligatory tax if they would even bring it up. It's important to remember that a corporation has the responsibility to bring value to their stakeholders, especially their shareholders. What this means is through profits. So why would a company choose to pay an additional tax when clearly they will be negatively impacted economically? It seems a little confusing and also not very effective. Socially, yes, it is important that the content that they get is what they're looking for. But it's also important that the quality of that content, the quality of the services they're receiving remain, if not increase. And as we've already discussed, that is not something that will be happening. Fundamentally, what's going to be happening is that the consumer is going to be the one suffering from this tax. While it may not be compulsory, the choice that the corporation has to either, yes, apply this tax or not, is either going to be taken when they decide, are they going to increase prices for the consumers, or are they going to decrease their service quality and, for example, lay off employees and have other negative consequences socially to their stakeholders. Fundamentally, Canada has deemed that internet access is a basic need. It's a necessity for Canadian citizens, for all humans. And what this tax is trying to do is essentially remove the efficiency, the effectiveness of the internet. The entire point of it being that it's readily available at an affordable price for all. We are side opposition, and what we stand for is creating value for the consumer and protecting the Canadian consumer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now call the first member of government for his speech of 3 minutes, for which the first and last 30 seconds are protected.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank side opposition for some of their points. However, we as side government believe that their understanding is a little bit off. Before I continue to build on some of our points mentioned by our Prime Minister, I'd like to take some time to refute and talk about some of the things brought up by our opposition. So, one of the things they talk about is the idea that increasing and placing an IMP on companies which are willing is going to heavily damage their revenues, is going to cause them to force to raise prices towards consumers. What they are failing to realize, Mr. Speaker, is this is a cycle. This is revenue being generated by the content being created by this investment. It is clear that we have to understand this is an investment and not simply a tax being deducted away from what their earnings are. Furthermore, what they fail to realize is that these huge companies, Bell, Rogers, are increasing revenues each and every single year. Each year we're seeing their ISP revenues are at a record high. They have the funds available in order to take some of that money away in order to generate more revenue down the line. Now, why do we know this works? See, side opposition comes and talks about this idea. However, we're going to provide some solid facts. Now, Canadian company Vice was a very, very small media generator. When they rose to fame, they were able to create a lot of content. This is what drove their rise in terms of their company. They first started out with Vice, their main channel, and increased to Noisy, Munchies, on the radio, Vice Sports, podcasts, meetings on social media. As we can see, in the beginning, they put their revenue into generating content. And in return, now they are one of the largest Canadian news outlets on the internet, on YouTube, and on over the world. We can see that generating content, investing into content, is a strategy that works, and in so, this is an incentive for our companies. Now, furthermore, they talk about this idea of a bias, that companies are going to be a little bit biased towards generating Canadian content. Do they realize currently Canadian content is being drowned out by the massive amount of content available out there? When we think about how a Canadian is portrayed stereotypically in media, it is a person in snow who is very, very nice and probably is holding some maple syrup. This is not what we want to be displayed at. What we as side government really urge and we want to do is to give Canadians a platform for their own voice, a voice that is from them, content that is created from the inside, and content that accurately represents us. How can we say another country, another producer, and other content generators can display us properly, Mr. Speaker? This is simply absurd. On side government, we are for the people. We want people in order to be able to voice their opinions. And when we provide a strategy which is viable, proven through Vice News and their strategy, we can see that this has no harm in any way. And again, this is something that is optional. We are compelling companies. And this, for the reasons that I provided and the reasons my colleague will continue to provide, we strongly propose this. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call the first member of the opposition for his speech of 3 minutes, for which first and last 30 seconds are protected.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, honorable judges, members of side government. Side opposition would like to thank side government for their remarks. However, today they have failed to demonstrate why this motion would be a viable option for Canadian citizens. Today, my esteemed colleague already discussed how passing such a motion would potentially be a burden on Canadian consumers if these companies do decide to go forth with this particular tax. I shall now be further elaborating on our second point, which is that Canadian ISPs are simply not responsible for this tax. Following this, I shall move on to the refutation of side government's points and finally offer my closing remarks. Thus, to begin, Canadian ISPs are corporations, as mentioned by my esteemed colleague. They are interested in one thing, generating profits, not only for themselves, but also for all the stakeholders within the company. The entire idea of presenting an optional tax for a private corporation may not seem like the most attractive feature. The other point that needs to be brought up is that Canadian media only represents a fraction of the entire media available on the internet that these internet service providers do offer to Canadian citizens. The fact of the matter is that we now live in a global economy. We have a very multicultural society within Canada, and Canadian media might pass under the radar for certain Canadian citizens. It is not an issue that is important for all Canadian citizens, unfortunately, although it should be. The fact of the matter is that not only are private corporations not necessarily convinced to pay such a tax, but also it is not in the interest of their customers who would potentially be paying higher prices, as my colleague already mentioned. Moving on to my refutation, side government did mention that passing such a motion would be an opportunity for Canadian companies, ISPs, to contribute to Canadian pride. As I mentioned beforehand, Canadian pride is something that unfortunately is passing under the radar for many Canadians. We live in a melting pot society. Our culture is very diverse, and we are proud of that diversity here in Canada. We are proud to be a multi-diverse country. And although generating Canadian content is important, we do not think, as side opposition, that it should be a main concern for internet service providers, and that we should find other ways to fund the Canadian Media Fund. That being said, today we spoke about how this motion would be a burden for consumers if this tax is passed. I spoke about how Canadian ISPs are not responsible for paying such a tax. And finally, we shall talk about how funding media is not generally a priority for Canadian consumers. We are side opposition, and we stand for protecting the Canadian consumers. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call the second member of the government for her speech of 4 minutes, for which the first and last 30 seconds are protected.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will be spending the next 4 minutes refuting the points that opposition has brought to the table, as well as reconstructing and building on the points that our Prime Minister, as well as the other member of government, has brought up. First, I think side opposition said it best when they said that we're in a global economy. We are global. It is no secret that we must be on a global stage and therefore maintain competitiveness, not just in Canadians. Through this motion and through the investment into a fund and the compelling tax that we are recommending, we would be able to provide more Canadian content to ISPs, therefore putting us on a bigger stage. Having more Canadian content means that we will be able to show our true Canadian colors, who we really are as Canadians and what it means to be Canadian through this content that is available. As a member of government brought up the example of Vice, this is a real example of how we can demonstrate how to be Canadian. Through the generation of more content, Vice was able to put on a platform that shows and how much of a powerhouse Canada really is and how we should not be underestimated on the world stage. This is a real example that shows the benefits of investment into generation of content. Through this compelling tax, which again is an option, not something that is being mandated or forced towards these internet service providers, they will benefit in the long run because it is a cycle. Through the investment into the Canadian content and the Canadian Media Fund, Canadian companies and corporations will be able to take this money and put it back onto the internet service providers. They are benefiting in the long run, and it is a win-win situation for both parties. Further, we talk about, opposition said generating revenue, that's important, and that internet service providers, that is their main goal. However, based on what was discussed on government, through this investment in this tax, they will be able to do such a thing, generating revenue, more revenue, looking in the long term, not just the short term. With the amount of revenues that they have, through offering this tax, they will be able to have more Canadian providers using their internet services, and therefore more Canadians choosing to choose Canadian content on their internet service providers. I will now go into the last argument of government, which is the moral obligation of government and Parliament to be able to make sure that Canadians are being heard globally. We have the obligation to give them the platform. This, as opposition said, we are Canadians and we need a global stage. It is a global economy. We are diverse and people need to know this. People need to have the power and the tools that make them heard throughout Canada and all over the world. Providing this tax, again, is a long-term benefit for both Canadians, consumers, and government. I will not be taking your question. And this will provide them with the necessary tools to be shown worldwide. So to reiterate what was discussed today, the idea of a global market, the idea that we need to be demonstrated on a world stage. There's also the idea that there's real-life examples, like Vice and such as Crave TV, more Canadian companies that need to be heard. The idea of Crave, we need to give them the ability to be able to compete with bigger companies like Netflix, to be able to be shown on the world stage, to be shown against our American counterparts, as well as other services that are provided, giving them the funding that is necessary to show this, and therefore internet service providers are also benefiting in the long run. So it's for these reasons, Mr. Speaker, and the reasons that were brought up by the member of government as well as the Prime Minister on why we as government are proud to propose this motion. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call the second member of the opposition for his speech of 4 minutes, for which the first and last 30 seconds are protected.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, honorable judges, opposition. Today, I want to reiterate the arguments that my colleagues have presented, and then I'll move on to present my argument to finalize the refutation. The first two arguments were the burden was passed off to the customers, and the second argument was how Canadians ISPs are not responsible for this tax. My argument will be how funding media is not a priority for the Canadian government. Mr. Speaker, Canada's current deficit is 20 billion. The Canadian government has other priorities, such as healthcare, education, immigration, supporting Aboriginal reconciliation, and a few others amongst these. To put this into context, immigration, we have a commitment to receive 1 million immigrants by 2020. And therefore, this is a huge deficit in the budget, and we should prioritize it rather than investing in Canadian Media Fund. There are other alternatives, such as taxing foreign companies such as Netflix, that are already committed to invest 500 million in Canadian media, that have already set up a structure set up to support that media and inject it right away, rather than taxing companies whose results would be in the long term. And the healthcare, for instance, or the long waits in hospitals are a priority for Canadian citizens. I will not take any question right now, I'll take it later. Healthcare is a huge priority for Canadian citizens rather than Canadian media. The opposition has said that, well, I quote, "There's a lot of misconception of who we are." I think throughout the last decades, the Canadian government has shown internationally that we have a strong identity as Canadians through many events such as the Olympics, and last year during the Canadian 150th anniversary. We have a strong diversity, we know who we are, and therefore we should not invest this money into Canadian funding media. We should prioritize it to other basic needs that the Canadians need desperately rather than Canadian media. To move on, the environment. We have a huge commitment with the international allies to fulfill our commitments and invest in our environment projects. We have, in the Army too, we have a responsibility to invest 2% of our GDP that we're not fulfilling, and therefore it's a most needed necessity that investing in our Canadian media. Moving on into my refutation. The solution that the side government is proposing is a long-term solution, whereas we agree that we need to prioritize and give companies a shot to be competitive. But we realize that Bell and Rogers and Videotron already have a structure and infrastructure set up to invest money in funding media. But realistically, it's better off taxing foreign companies that have a better opportunity to commit and deliver what they're promising and invest in Canadian media. Yes?
The side opposition not recognize that this is, again, a foreign company, and thus the main voice of it will not be from a Canadian source?
Our focus is to tax foreign companies and invest that money into Canadian media rather than taxing Canadian customers. To finalize, we're the side opposition and we stand for protecting the consumer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'll call the Prime Minister for the conclusion speech of 3 minutes, for which the entire speech is protected.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A lot has been said across both sides, and what this really boils down to is one question: who does this affect most? When opposition comes up and says that this is not a priority, Mr. Speaker, this is very disheartening. We are very capable of focusing on multiple fronts and focusing on multiple priorities. We are not one-track minded, and we can do multiple things at a time. If we're focusing on our immigration policies, we can focus at the same time on providing internet content. In fact, if we want to raise awareness on our immigration problems, why not use an internet platform, Mr. Speaker? Why not use these media contents that we are having internet providers pay into to further broaden that message? Mr. Speaker, when we look at who benefits and who loses from this, Mr. Speaker, we see that there are 3 key players. We see that there are the internet providers, we see that there are the Canadian citizens, and we also see that there are the citizens on the international stage, Mr. Speaker. We have, and as opposition says, we have a strong identity. We are very proud to be Canadian. And Mr. Speaker, if we are proud to be Canadian, we should really be enforcing the fact that we are proud to be Canadian. By having these providers pay into the tax, which again is not mandatory, they are not obligated to do so, it shows that they are proud to air the Canadian content. If we're looking at Canadian companies and Canadian internet service providers showing that they're proud to have this content, Mr. Speaker, that reflects globally, that reflects on that international stage, and that reinforces that strong identity that we have as Canadians. Mr. Speaker, when government comes up and talks to you about what the economic benefits are, we see that economically it'll benefit the internet providers as well as the economy, and it will be beneficial to Canadian citizens. When we see the money going in, it's an investment. Mr. Speaker, there will be the return coming in. By investing the money in, we will see the further Canadian content being generated, which can help send out any message that we want to be heard globally or even just in Canada, Mr. Speaker. When we have a problem nowadays, we turn to social media. We turn to the media because they have the biggest voice and they can really make sure that our messages are clearly aired across the globe. And we need to recognize, Mr. Speaker, that this is a priority and we want our messages to be heard and we want our voices to be heard. If we don't have any mechanisms in place to really make sure this exists, Mr. Speaker, we're just drowning out our own voices. That in itself should be a problem. We should recognize that there are many problems to be faced and everybody is affected by this, whether it's looking at the consumer who pays into the internet service provider or if it's just the Canadian companies that are paying this tax. Mr. Speaker, we need to recognize that there are going to be consequences and benefits across the board. But the question is then, is the benefits outweighing the consequences? And Mr. Speaker, the answer is yes. If we pay this additional tax, we will see more benefits than consequences. Paying a tax is common at this point, and we need to recognize that the benefits that come from it are so much greater than just accepting the consequences. And it's for these reasons, Mr. Speaker, that we are proud to propose.
Thank you. I now call the opposition leader with conclusion speech of 3 minutes entirely protected.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, honorable judges, side government. I'll begin by reminding ourselves what the motion is, what side opposition's main arguments were brought forward, and finally, I will refute side government for the final time. The motion brought here today was that this House would compel internet service providers to pay an additional tax to finance Canadian Media Fund. The three main arguments brought forward by side opposition were that this burden was going to be passed off onto the consumer, that the Canadian ISP should be responsible for this tax, and that finally, funding media is not a priority in regards to all the other priorities we have. Side government has brought up a stereotype, for example, igloos and syrup, and fundamentally, the side opposition believes this is totally incorrect. Instead, Canada is mostly seen as a diverse country with free healthcare, access to all, great and even outstanding education. And fundamentally, it is side opposition's priority to not just look better, but to be better. That is why side opposition believes it's important to invest in other areas, because until we are great in those, we shouldn't be worried about how we look to others. Side government also mentioned how ISPs are currently making a lot of money, and that might be one of the reasons why they would choose to invest in this. Then why would they opt in this investment if they're already making so much? That's a question. Potentially there's an answer. Potentially there is a lot of money to be made within these opportunities, these Canadian media opportunities. Then the question remains, why bother with a tax? If it is a great investment, if it is something that these companies would do either way, why are we bothering to compel them with a tax if this is a great investment? That's because a tax is for something that fundamentally consumers, companies won't want to do. And that is why we believe that the government feels the need to impose this as an optional tax, because they know that fundamentally corporations won't want to invest in this because potentially there aren't that many revenue generating opportunities to be had. Fundamentally, it's the government's belief that Canadian culture is under threat, that there is an existential threat at the moment and that we need to act right away to save it. However, that's simply not the case according to side opposition. We firmly know that our priority is to invest elsewhere. Unfortunately, the reality is that there are limited funds. It is possible to have a broad outreach. However, it's not realistic to believe that we can't prioritize. There's a reason why priorities are important. Finally, we are side opposition, and we firmly believe in protecting the Canadian consumer. And that is why we know that this motion today will not pass. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to all the team. Have a good lunch.
Non, c'est pas moi qui va poser la question.
Arrête de d'écrire avec la main du diable, puis... Hey, Colin, hey, je me serais...
Ah, bordel. C'est bon?
Je me serais endormi sur ce débat.
Non, il était moins pire que l'autre.
Ouais, je pense aussi que c'est parce qu'on a faim.
Ouais. C'est aussi le ton des voix. Il y en avait, à part un là, qui...
Moi, le ton, j'ai faim, ils sont très posés, ils répétaient souvent.
Ah, ouais.
Moi, je décrochais des fois, je partais 15 secondes, j'étais comme « Oh! »
Bon, moi j'ai mis mes scores ici, je vais aller être rapidement, puis je vais le faire.
Mais tu sais, c'est comme...
En gros, je vais procéder, puis quand tu reviens, on confirme que tu es d'accord.
Je suis sûr, mes scores sont tous là.
Ah ouais? Ok.
J'ai mis 2 colonnes, puis j'ai mis des commentaires encore en dessous, puis je vais le faire.
C'est comme écouter les feux de l'amour. Tu décroches 15 secondes, tu reviens, ils sont à la même place.
Non, mais le pire, c'est que c'était un peu ça.
Oui, oui.
Comme j'ai...
Ben, c'était très
J'avoue que
répétitif.
l'argument à
Très
l'universitaire, j'avais pas pensé à celle-là. Mais c'était vraiment ça.
Mais moi, je trouve ça drôle parce que, tu sais, avant, on disait que le Canada, il ne file pas les enjeux culturels comme nous. Là.
Ouais.
C'est comme au Canada, c'est genre, c'est une menace, il faut se protéger. Au Canada, c'est genre Canadian Pride, for the win, right.
Moi, c'est un peu ténu comme lien là, de dire genre, faut qu'on taxe parce que comme ça, on va pouvoir être plus canadiens. C'est un peu.
Ben, il y avait de quoi. Je suis pas sûr qu'ils l'ont été assez.
Ouais, c'est ça.
Comme...
Il y avait de quoi, là, t'as raison.
Taxe optionnelle.
Taxe optionnelle.
À base, c'est n'importe quoi.
C'est un argument, là.
Ça, je sais pas. Je pense. J'essaie d'analyser. Je pense que.
Excusez-moi, ça sera pas très long. Je pense que la caméra est encore en train de filmer. Je veux juste...
Oh!